The Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
And we are not live. We are recording this next episode of the Christmas Latina Show. How are you doing, Nina?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm all right, I would say. Probably at this moment, when this is going live, I'm going to be full and not feeling like doing anything.
Are you going to be wearing the same? Are you going to be wearing the same Santa hat?
For sure.
Yeah, so we're so concerned about our audience that we're bringing you an episode even when everyone's having a little break, hopefully having a little break to celebrate new calendar Christmas. For those of us who celebrate the old calendar Christmas on January 7th, i.e. yours truly, I get to celebrate two Christmases, the upcoming Christmas in a more secular way, the old calendar Christmas in a more religious way, and the New Year. So it's sort of a season of celebration and maybe too much food. So hopefully you guys are, when you're watching this from the future, you are having at least a little bit of fun and not working the entire week like I am, but I digress. So today we wanted to, despite the happy occasion of a Western Christmas week, we wanted to discuss maybe a less than happy topic. I am calling it in a very dark way, the death of democracy. Perhaps we'll call the episode something different when we release it. So the reason we wanted to talk about this topic is because there have been a number of elections this year. One of them took place in Moldova, which is a post-Soviet state. Another one took place in Georgia, another post-Soviet state. And another one took place in Romania, which today is a NATO country, but back in the day it was also a country that was sort of in the eastern sphere of influence. And the reason we wanted to talk about this is because we all heard for years and years and years talk about the importance of democracy coming from the official West. Now, the definition of democracy has changed over time, right? If we go back to ancient Greece, to Athens, the source of the term democracy, this is a society that had slavery. So the definition of democracy was limited to a particular group of people, right? These were men, these were property-owning men that had particular rights to participate in that society at a political level. And that term has changed over time. And these days, it seems like in the official West, the term has been more instrumental than actually expressing maybe the popular will of the people. We see the term democracy thrown around a lot to lecture countries that are outside of the so-called rules-based order, where that's sort of a pressure point that you can use to criticize their domestic politics. Should those domestic politics and the foreign policy, of course, not match the what would benefit the official West, right? So what I kind of perceived this past year as is this dropping of all pretense, because usually what we think about is, free and fair elections with election monitors, et cetera, and ultimately the electorate expresses its will. Now, of course, there are all kinds of limits to the kinds of people that can participate in elections, people who have money, people that come from certain families. We can also maybe touch upon this topic, but be that as it may, we can leave this outside of, our topic for now. But it seems that it's more about getting a good result, the right result for the official West, no matter how many times a certain country has to vote, instead of actually having this popular expression. And this is why we want to focus on the three countries that I mentioned: Moldova, Georgia, Romania, but we also want to bring in some other countries that would kind of make our point a little bit more clear. And for this reason, we invited Alex Krainer back. He's one of our most popular guests. I think he's constantly requested, both in the comments, but also through private messages. He is an economic analyst. He is a political analyst who operates out of Europe. So Marcelo, let's bring him on.
Yeah, let's bring it home. So without further ado, Alex Krainer. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back.
Greetings to your viewers and listeners.
In the future, celebrating New Calendar Christmas. Alex, since we last had you, which was fairly recent, is there anything else new that you've been working on that we haven't discussed in the previous episodes?
Oh, I think pretty much nothing has been happening. It's been kind of slow. So, no, I'm joking, of course. So much has happened that I think it's become very, very difficult to keep up. So when you ask me like this, has there been something new? I don't even know where to start. But I think that what you mentioned is a good subject to discuss, and I don't think it's inappropriate to call it death of democracy, or maybe. What we had was a fake democracy. We just never realized it until we started voting in the wrong people.
Yeah, that would be a good way to describe it, voting in the wrong people. Go ahead.
May I just say something here that you said something amazing here. Until we started to voting the wrong people. In Brazil, I'm Brazilian, and in Brazil, for my entire life, what I heard was that, people don't know how to vote. And, you're an investor, you're someone who deal with numbers. Statistically, by mistake, we would have elected someone right after, 10 times. And this has been the mantra on Brazil since ever. So I just wanted to leave this thought for the people.
I think it's something we typically, in my area of expertise, which is Russia and the former Soviet Union, we hear this a lot from the so-called Russian liberals who are West-facing. And when we say West, we mean the official political West, not the people of the West that might have disagreements with the political system. And they usually have a very dismissive attitude toward the general public. And sometimes the type of terminology they use to describe the general public is mind-blowing, all the way to the point of calling them a biomass. I mean, just extremely harsh, denigrating language where they're just complete idiots. They are, uneducated. They don't know what they're doing. And at the same time, these are the people that ultimately want to participate in Russian politics as they're insulting the electorate in such a harsh way. So I think this idea of people don't know how to vote is obviously condescending, right, in its most obvious expression, but there's also a lot of classism and other types of, elitism basically embedded in this type of thinking. So I think that's also something that we can touch upon. But first, I wanted to jump into the question of Moldova, right? So this is an ex-Soviet country, but it's a country that has EU aspirations. This country is strategically important to the official West because it's right around the Black Sea, right? This is a very important region, as is Romania, as is present-day southern Ukraine. So all of those countries are sort of in this region, as is Georgia. So I think that's another interesting side note that we can talk about the geostrategic location of these places and why they would be important to the official West. But anyway, this country has EU aspirations, as they like to call it in the official Western media. The presidential candidate that had these aspirations, that was, taking lovely pictures with Zelensky and meeting all the talking heads from the European Union, Maya Sandu, she was actually not supposed to win in this election that took place earlier this year. And her opponent, Alexander, I'm going to butcher the name, Stoyanoglu, he was sort of more neutral, more left-wing. He sort of tried to satisfy different parts of the Moldovan electorate and maybe have some connections to Russia and some connections to the European Union. He was supposed to win. But there are all kinds of manipulations that took place in that particular election. And one of them was basically relying on the expats that live abroad. And this is a really interesting question, first and foremost, because if you think about people who live abroad for a long time, should they really have a say in the politics, even if they have citizenship, right, of the country that they left, because they haven't been there in decades? And I'm one of these people, and I haven't voted in Russian elections, even though I can, because, well, one of the reasons we talked about this earlier is logistics, but another reason, I'm not actually there to dictate, day-to-day life. It doesn't really make sense to me to do that. Although in many ways, I would probably agree with the majority of the population when it comes to big questions of foreign policy, culture, society, and so on and so forth. So that's one question. Yes, they have citizenship. We know it's legal for them to vote, but should they really do that? But the other question is that there was a deliberate manipulation in terms of which expats could vote. And there's a huge Moldovan population working in Russia. The estimates I've seen are anywhere between 300,000 to 500,000, right? 500,000. That's a huge population. But they only opened 2 locations where all of these people could vote. So I think it was only like in Moscow where they could go. And obviously that doesn't really count for people who live in other cities, nor is it physically possible to accommodate even a smaller percentage of this huge population that was interested in participating in the election. So by manipulating the actual physical process, those people were not able to vote. And obviously all kinds of requests were made to allow them to carry out their democratic rights, as the official West likes to call it, and that did not happen. At the same time, expats in other countries, Marcelo, I was reading, I think, some statistics for Italy where the number is quite small. I think they had like 10 different locations where they could go, even though there are only a few thousand Moldovans living in Italy. So there was that kind of skewing that was all out in the media. Of course, that entire election was also accompanied by, the typical slogan of Russian influence. We never talk about the, Western influence, EU influence, because that's a good influence, according to these people, but Russian influence, which I've never really seen, was a bad influence. I think what they call Russian influence is basically the people with some respect for their Soviet history or any kind of shared roots that they may still maintain. So be that as it may, these are the people that allowed Maia Sandu to win the election. And of course, the EU was applauding left and right, even though there was a very obvious electoral manipulation taking place. Now, we can contrast that with the case of Romania, where the candidate who won, I'm also probably going to butcher his name. I think Americans say Georgescu. I probably would say Georgescu, I'm guessing. And anyway, the media has been smearing him as a far-right candidate. As you know, that's usually a go-to term when you want to undermine the person's actual politics so that people see the slogans and don't actually go and investigate what he stands for. There's been talk of him being a little bit cool on the subject of the war in Ukraine and the general militarization of Europe. And he won. And then the Constitutional Court he won the first round of these elections. And then the Constitutional Court decided to overturn this on the basis of Russian propaganda on TikTok, which absolutely blew my mind, because we know Putin is known for employing TikTok to manipulate elections and change election results. So you basically had 2 countries. In one country, there was an obvious election manipulation, but the EU received the result that it wanted. So there was a lot of applause, and, Maia, a good old middle manager that, is very common in the European Union these days. These are the people we like. They're very much interchangeable. And then we have this other more of a popular candidate in Romania, but that candidate was not okay. So I think the contrast between the two was absolutely striking. So Alex, what do you think about these 2 so far?
Well, I think that the matter is so obvious that you almost have to have the patience of a saint to go over the details to try to explain this to somebody, because if they don't get it by now, they might never get it. So telling them all these things about how many voting stations in Russia, how many in Italy, and all these things, it's very, very, very obvious that the West wants desperately to regime change and partition Russia. It's not a mystery why. And why is control of the collateral for the Western banking system to be able to turn the Russian people into their cheap labor force and to take control over their natural wealth so that this can become collateral for Western banking system based on which they can issue loans so that all this wealth kind of gravitates to them. It's like constructing a giant vacuum cleaner or conveyor belt that transfers wealth from Russia to London and to New York and other European financial centers. And Russia is in the world by far the wealthiest nation in terms of natural resources, with estimated 75 to 100 to 90 trillion dollars worth. Now, knowing that we operate on a fractional reserve banking, which now since pretty much since COVID, this went under the radar, but they've, I think under CARES Act or some bill that was passed at that time, maybe some Appropriations Act, they pretty much declared that the legal reserve requirements for the U.S. banking system is 0%, meaning that they can issue loans based on nothing, out of thin air, no reserves required. Okay, so all these manipulations are subordinated to these agendas. They don't care whether, the elections in Romania or Moldova or Georgia or Ukraine or Germany or Poland or anywhere accurately reflect the will of the people. They want their agenda pursued and enabled. And so they want candidates who will carry water for them. And the countries you mentioned, Romania, Moldova, Georgia, in addition to Ukraine, were designated as countries that would be weaponized as proxies to wage war against Russia. We were all talking about how they were going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainians. Oh, they got there. Now they're pressuring Ukraine to start conscripting 18-year-olds, meaning they're running out. They're really running out of Ukrainians to sacrifice. So the next, you have Moldova and Georgia. I'll say another piece of information because this is also relevant. Usually, the preparations for all this take a very long time, and one of the first things that you start doing is you start immiserating the nation, meaning you destroy its economy, and then you have very high youth unemployment. You have a large population of young men, military-age men, who have nothing to do, have no jobs, no future, no prospect, no way to fulfill their aspirations in life, get married, have children, raise a family, buy a house, all of those things. So Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. So all these countries became independent in 1991, Ukraine and Georgia, among others. If you look at the economic performance of countries between 1991 and 2014, so that's 24 years period, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova were number one, number two, and number three worst economic performing nations in the world. Only over that 24-year period, only 5 nations in the whole world had negative GDP growth. And the first 3 were exactly these, the ones that are, hugging Russia's soft southern underbelly, designated as, bludgeons to use against Russia. So now, everybody has seen what happened to Ukraine, and everybody more or less understands how this happened and why this happened. And so people in these countries are saying, hell no, We don't want this. We don't want to become cannon fodder in the empire's war against Russia. And so they're voting for candidates who are saying, we're not going to take it to war against Russia. We want to have good relations with West, but also with East and with Russia. And so these candidates are starting to either win election or the elections are being stolen from them. Case in point, Moldova. But it's not unique either, same thing in France, same thing in Germany, same thing everywhere.
The UK.
South Korea. It's all over the place. It's hard to keep up anymore. And it's gotten so obvious that it's ridiculous, actually. It's embarrassing because the mask has slipped off completely. This whole image of a benevolent West, which is watching over the savages of the global South and other uncivilized countries, so that they know how to vote and hold free and fair elections, and all of this blah 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 blah, is obviously false. It's obviously fake. For people who have, so I'm talking, even if you're just not even paying attention to everything and you're just looking at events as they happen, but if you do pay attention, then you know that the Western powers have developed a whole range of social technologies to manipulate elections, i.e., the segment of the population that is going to vote against your interests. Well, you make sure that something goes wrong. You give them very few voting stations. You announce it the last moment. You make sure it's difficult to get to. You make sure the computers break down, or any number of things. It's just plain sabotage. Where you know that they're going to vote in favor, well, there you make sure. Well, I'm from Croatia. We have a large diaspora. I think there's maybe as many Croats living outside Croatia as inside Croatia. And the scandals with diaspora votes go back as far as Croatian democracy has been in existence. They always use it to manipulate elections. That's just what's being done. So I think that explaining this is only necessary for people who really have been under the rock until about now. And I think that for everybody else, if they still don't get it, well then, they have to be left behind. They have to carry on believing what they believe, but the world's moving on, and it's obvious that the people who are determining the agenda for the Western world are completely focused on achieving this total war between the collective West and Russia. So
do you think the mask has fallen because of the economic situation in the West more so than previously?
I think that the mask has fallen off primarily because of the defeat in Ukraine. In the beginning, they were all pretending to be, and then let's not forget Palestine. They were all pretending to be outraged that Russia was violating international law and international norms, and it's an affront to civilized behavior of us who are so much better in the West than these Russian troglodytes and so on and so forth. But then
orcs. Remember, we're orcs. It's for whatever reason
they
orcs started
Ukraine,
using.
I think the term hasn't quite made it westwards.
No, but, it's definitely very prevalent on social media. So it was very interesting, that whole Lord of the Rings reference between, the beautiful elves and the scary orcs to designate the Russians. I think it was a a pretty interesting. I mean, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense literally used Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings propaganda in the first few months of the war to appeal, I think, to the younger crowd in the West. So this was definitely something that was permeating social media and popular
and
culture a
Hunger
little bit.
Games. And Hunger Games.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I think that the result is that as the West, as it began to dawn on the West that they're being defeated, they started supporting Ukraine more and more in spite of many rules that they were breaking in doing all that. You know, Zelensky bans opposition, arrests opposition politicians. The West doesn't protest. Ukrainian intelligence agencies have a kill list with people that they want to eliminate, and then they eliminate them and they, celebrate, they cross out their faces, their portraits. The West doesn't protest, right? They openly celebrate World War II Nazis. They don't celebrate. In Canada, they have a standing ovation. The complete Parliament of Canada gives a standing ovation to an actual Nazi, because suddenly it doesn't matter whether you were Nazi so long as you fought against the Russians, and so on and so forth. Then starts the war in the Middle East. The Israelis start slaughtering Palestinians in large numbers. And now all of a sudden, all these international norms and civilized behavior and targeting of civilians, all of that falls by the wayside. It's no longer important. Israel has the right to defend themselves, and that's that. We're going to give them all the bombs and all the targeting information and all the intelligence and all the ammunition and everything they need. Carry on, kill as many as you like. We don't care. So, it's very, very hard now for anybody to convince anybody anywhere in the world, not just in the global South, in Russia, in other countries, but even the populations in Europe. It's very, very hard to convince them anymore that this is some kind of a benevolent, civilized behavior, that we just want people to support human rights and democracy and all of these lovely things that they were seducing us with for generations now. And so the mask has slipped away gradually, but it has slipped away so thoroughly that there's no putting it back on. There's no unseeing what we have seen. And I forgot to mention also the COVID-19 pandemic. The way they handle that was also chillingly totalitarian. And they didn't care about any of those, like my body, my choice, bodily autonomy, informed consent, first do no harm. All of these things that we have pretended for so long were our civilizational heritage. And, our values. How many times have we heard politicians wax eloquent about our values? Because, it's our values that make us so much better than everybody else in the world, especially the Russians. But now it turns out that our values are pretty much totalitarianism, Satanism, deviancy, and genocide, I should say, and pretty much a general attitude of hatred towards God and life. Prove me wrong. I'd like somebody to convince me that I'm wrong, but this is what I see, and it's so consistent, it's so pervasive that you just really have to be willfully blind to not see it.
Well, I think there are a couple of issues that are happening here. And to your point about the exploding war in the Middle East, I think the newest trope this week was that Israel shifts borders that are fluid. And as we know, Russia annexes and violates territorial integrity. So when you put those side by side from the same news sources, it's just kind of amazing. I think the most recent article was about, the Israeli borders shifting into Syria, and that's okay. So border shift is my new favorite go-to term. Should anyone ever criticize anyone else again? I think that was kind of the newest mask slipping example. But I think there are some cases where that shift was very obvious. So we just talked about the Romanian Constitutional Court using a bogus reason to overturn the first round of the election results, right, where the candidate was not up to standards of the official West. Well, if we go to Ukraine, now we know that Zelensky's mandate has expired in May 2024, and he's still president. And of course, the official reason for that is that it's wartime measures. He has to stay in power. I can't hold elections. Now, first and foremost, we have many examples of countries, including Russia this year, that has had elections. But obviously, the United States during World War II had elections, or the United States during the Civil War had elections. So sort of external war and an internal war, lots and lots of examples where that didn't stop people from electing a new leader. Now, the other interesting thing about this particular incident, let's call it this way, is that they basically had to reinterpret the Constitution to allow him to work, for himself to allow himself to stay. Let's put it this way. But when it comes to the reaction from the official West, in 2021, Zelensky actually ended up firing a bunch of constitutional judges, and then he appointed the ones that he wanted. But this was before the special military operation. So when you go and look at the media coverage of when he did that, some of the Western media is actually pretty critical of his doing so. Now, these days, we know that the Constitutional Court in Ukraine that has the judges that are, loyal to him are not going to question anything that he did in 2024. But I think it's very interesting how that criticism completely evaporated since the war in Ukraine hasn't been going according to plan. So that's one thing. I think it's very interesting to me that you also brought South Korea into the discussion. I'm not an expert. I don't know if you're an expert on South Korea, but one thing that I found that was very interesting is that it seems to be that some people believe that President Yoon is the source of that whole North Koreans in Ukraine fighting for Russia propaganda. There's some information floating about that online. I don't know how true it is, but that seems to be one of the sources. And of course, go ahead.
I'm not sure if he's the source, but he definitely harped on that one hard, because the whole incredible, spectacular blow up in South Korea is also defined by the West's imperial agenda to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian or last whoever, and to partition Russia and to regime change Russia and to take over the wealth of Russia. Namely, in fighting Russia in Ukraine, the West has pretty much disarmed itself. They ran out of 155 millimeter shells and 105 millimeter rounds and Patriot missiles and you name it. They just ran out of pretty much everything. They're running short. They're having difficulty ramp up production. So Ukraine, even if it could continue to defend itself, they are running thin on not only on men but also on weaponry. And so the one nation that is allied with the West that has abundant stockpiles of NATO compatible ammunitions and weapons is South Korea. And so they were desperate to tap those stockpiles and to send them to Ukraine, except that the South Korean law prohibits such transfers of weapons. And South Korean political opposition and the public are overwhelmingly opposed to getting involved in any way, shape, or form in the Ukraine war. and it's 82%. The 82% of the public are dead against being involved in Ukraine war. And so what do? So you declare martial law. You install pretty much a military-style dictatorship. You apply blanket censorship, so nobody knows what's being done, and then you send weapons and troops to South Korea, to Ukraine. And so President Yoon has been talking about this a lot. So the preparations for this martial law, which was declared on the night between 3rd and 4th December this month, they started. My understanding is already in June, July of this year. So they've been going on for months. And their brilliant, cunning plan was to provoke the North Koreans into attacking South Korea so that they would have a pretext for declaring the martial law. So what they did is in early October of this year, they went and they flew drones over Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, and they dropped propaganda leaflets. Very obvious South Korea launched propaganda leaflets dropped on North Korea. Quite a provocation. And so they thought, these North Korean primitives, they're just going to whack us with missiles, artillery, whatever, and then we're going to declare martial law. Brilliant. Except the North Koreans are not exactly so stupid, so they didn't take the bait and nothing happened. So when things got desperate, Yoon just declared martial law for no good reason. And the people in South Korea are like, huh? What the hell? What's going on? And they didn't take it lying down. So immediately, I think the speaker of the parliament somehow through his YouTube channel managed to reach out to the lawmakers, to the representatives, and they all rushed to the parliament. And 190 of them got there because the president also sent the police and the military to block so that nobody can go there. Anyway, 190 of them got there on time, and they held a vote, and they demanded the lifting of the martial law. And so, according to South Korean constitution, if the majority in the parliament votes for the lifting of the martial law, then the president has to do it. And so 190 out of 190 voted in favor of lifting the martial law. And so the guy painted himself into a corner. He had nothing else to do but to lift the martial law and say, oops, my bad, didn't mean nothing by it, but everybody go back to work. Except now, they've been arresting a lot of the conspirators. Not that there are conspiracies like people deciding what to do in smoke-filled rooms, right? That doesn't exist. It's just like the coup just kind of unfolded all of its own. But anyway, a lot of these people are now arrested. They're in prison. They're being questioned and deposed. And a lot of stuff is coming out, which is extremely embarrassing. And the majority of people in South Korea are convinced that this was a U.S. orchestrated coup attempt. Why would they think that? I don't know, but they do. That's apparently a fact. And so now, to me, this is a spectacular story because without the real pretext, the whole thing was so desperate. It really had a snowball's chance in hell of working. And this is another example where the mask slipped off, because not only is most likely the United States, or who knows, maybe the Brits, involved behind deep in the shadows, behind the curtains. But the official London or Washington, who are always busy lecturing everybody else about freedom and democracy, didn't have anything to say about this. They didn't call on President Yoon to, reinstate democracy and to lift the martial law because, we only support democracies, and if the people decide that they don't want to give us weapons for Ukraine, then we don't want those weapons. It's not like that, obviously. And so, South Korea is another example in this long sequence of examples where the political class is in a panic. The democracy is it's a complete circus, and it seems to me that they're running around like headless chickens.
For those of you guys that haven't seen the report that Alex was referring to about dropping leaflets over North Korea, go read it. Go read a summary. It's absolutely like a bad movie with using special forces. And if this happens, we're going to kill our own special forces. We're going to dress them in North Korean uniforms. We're not talking about South Korea, North Korea here, but it's just when I read it, I was like, how can this even be real? Like this, this was coming out. It was mind blowing.
Yeah. If you saw a movie with this plot, you'd think like, come on. People are not that stupid, are they? But apparently they are. But, I thought that, I still think that they're not that stupid, but what I do think is they're that desperate and they don't have a better plan. So they, they're now at a point of throwing whatever they can reach at the wall to see if something by chance will stick, because the time is running out and they're losing.
I think a lot of this, though, in addition to popping bubbles about democracy and not even commenting officially about Yoon's most cringe 6-hour coup d'etat, probably in the history of coup d'etats, is the fact that they themselves buy the BS about North Koreans being crazy and Kim being crazy, and they're sort of like, we're going to do this. Of course he is going to respond, much like they paint other leaders outside of the rules-based order as being crazy and unpredictable. And, he obviously saw this as a very obvious attempt at provocation. He didn't respond to this. So what does that tell you? It's almost like they're buying their own BS, and it actually doesn't pan out the way that they think it would, because they're not actually analyzing the countries they're dealing with in a reasonable way, in a way they might respond. And so I think that was another bubble that popped here. But yes, I think Yoon was go ahead.
I have to say that the meme machine for this was unbelievably funny. The pictures of Kim Jong laughing and say, who's the dictator now? Who's the crazy now? That was amazing. And just an FYI, I don't know if you follow Pepe Escobar. Just today, have you seen the post that he did on X with the picture of one of the ATACMS missiles that hit Russia recently? And, well, the serial number was actually from stockpile on South Korea.
Yes, I know. I saw that. Yes. Yeah.
So
just to make the plot even more funny.
Connect the dots, right? So
exactly.
I think this is sort of we normally don't talk about East Asia, but sometimes it's very much relevant. I mean, it's relevant in other ways too, in a way that, for instance, East Asia, even though South Korea and Japan kind of went along with Western sanctions, but kind of didn't. They maintained their trade with Russia in many ways. They had exemptions for buying energy from Russia. So that's kind of a separate topic. I think at some point we should look into, because it's a obviously very interesting region, a region that's just chock full of American military bases and soldiers that sometimes are not doing nice things over there. But yeah, we can talk about this later. Let's go back to Georgia. So what I wanted to briefly touch upon is that the thing, it seems like Georgia is one of those examples where the possible color revolutionary scenario did not go according to plan, right? So we have this country that was very hostile to Russia at one point, especially after the 2008 brief Russia-Georgia war, although we know through an EU-sponsored report that came out shortly after that it was then President Saakashvili that actually instigated that war. It wasn't Russia. But be that as it may, some Georgian perceived Russia as taking away their territory, although the two breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia broke away in the 90s. And that had a lot to do with the administrative borders of the Soviet Union being used outside of the Soviet space after the dissolution, much like in Ukraine and in other places. And those people, Abkhazians and South Ossetians, they perceived themselves to be oppressed by Georgians, or at least not having their full rights as an ethno-linguistic minority supported. So it didn't really have as much to do with Russia as the internal politics in Georgia. But anyway, Russia has been sort of protecting them. So this is where that clash between Russia and Georgia comes from, without going into too much of the history. And so we had Georgia on, even since the 90s, one of the first presidents, Shevardnadze, he would publicly, and he was like an old communist, and he was sort of the new leader in post-Soviet Georgia. He would announce his plans to eventually join NATO and, do the sort of typical worship of the official West then. And of course, then Saakashvili comes into power. And so he is this full Western trained, Western educated, younger leader who is, I guess initially pretty appealing because the myth of the West that's still pretty prevalent, right? In the early 2000s with the Rose Revolution in 2003. He's the one that actually brings in the current she will not leave president, Salome Zurabishvili, who's supposed to be leaving very, very shortly after the new president was elected, but she's been demanding and basically pulling a mini Zelensky. I'm not going to leave.
No, should be today. No, 20 December is her last day. No.
I think it was the 29th, but the elections took place on the 14th.
Yeah.
That's when it was pretty obvious that, no, lady, you're not staying. But anyway, so this is when she, a French-born citizen and former NATO staffer, a Bzezhinsky student, so she kind of has this full resume of being a foreign agent. All of a sudden, she comes into Georgian politics. She gets citizenship of a country where she's never lived. Again, speaking of expats that were born outside, this is another, can of worms. And so we basically have Georgia on this anti-Russian, pro-West path. And in the second decade of the century, the 21st century, a bunch of parties pop up, like the Georgian Dream, which is the ruling party. And at that stage, that party was following the EU ascension path. It was founded by a man whose last name is Ivanishvili. He is a businessman. And this is the guy they usually these days, whose name they throw around in the Western media about Russian influence, because he has some business in Russia. That's pretty much all they have. And so as we're heading into, the 2020s, things start happening in Georgia. Now, when it comes to EU ascension, it's not just certain economic obligations that they have to fulfill. They also have to fulfill certain cultural obligations. Georgia is a very socially conservative country, right? It's an Orthodox country. And so some of the more, as we'll call it radical liberal gender agenda is really not something that Georgians would subscribe to. So there are these smaller clashes that perhaps the outside world might not be seeing. And Georgians recognize that a lot of this is coming through the NGOs, and this is when they try to push through the so-called foreign agent law, which was basically and is a transparency law, right? If your NGO receives more than 20% of foreign funding, you should declare it. We want to see where the money is coming from, where it's going, which to me is completely reasonable. But of course, the official West freaks out because they're the ones using NGOs for good purposes and maybe sometimes nefarious purposes, right? Read between the lines. And so even though the countries that are criticizing Georgia for this themselves have pretty tough anti-foreign influence laws, they don't want Georgia to have this because for them it's an instrument. And so this is why we had all these protests earlier in the year in spring in Georgia, because that law did end up passing. And if you were following the coverage, it was being called the Russian law because Russia happens to have a similar law. But all of those laws in some shape or form relate to the 1938 FARA law because the original one comes from the US. Now, obviously, there are regional specifics and the way they change, but it has nothing to do with Russia. So that was one of the other sort of funny but very token propaganda techniques that were being used. And at that stage, the protests were happening. And I think this is when the Georgian authorities had a little bit of a training, basically, on how to manage these protests without going too far and then having, all the talking heads in the West accuse them of police brutality and not allowing the popular will of the people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, we have a lot of pressure coming from the EU. And we've had actually since 2022, some of the high-ranking politicians, I believe including the leader of the Georgian Dream, Prime Minister Kobakidze, talking about the plan to draw Georgia into the war in Ukraine as a second front. And I can't remember if it was he or someone else, but someone high-ranking. These were official interviews that some of them were in Georgian that made it into the Russian media. Some of them didn't make it into the English language media. You guys are welcome to do your own research. But basically, Georgians had a very clear understanding, the Georgian government, and probably many of the Georgian people, that, this is the plan. And we're much, much smaller than Ukraine, and we're not going to last like Ukraine, and we don't want to be completely devastated, right? So on top of that, according to, again, the leaders of the Georgian Dream Party, the EU was using unprecedented pressure for them to do certain things that were going against their own wishes on this ascension path. And Kobakidze talked about, I think in his words, he talked about threats and blackmail. Like, he used really serious terminology at one point where there was that assassination attempt on the Slovakian leader. The threats happened at the same time, and the Slovakian leader's name came up. You better be careful if you're out on the crowd.
Yes.
And then, of course, then the EU leaders, whoever the EU talking head was, I can't remember now, he clarified that, of course, he wasn't threatening. He just made it he just kind of brought up this example of this assassination attempt, but that's not how the Georgian leader interpreted it, right? So this is why he made it public as soon as possible to make sure that that the people know what the plans might be. Yeah, go ahead.
It was actually a Hungarian minister on the European, not related to Orban government by itself, just an MP from Hungary. I don't remember the guy's name.
Yeah, he was one of the people negotiating with Georgia. And of course, Kobakidze flipped out. All of this, he had a press conference. All of this was published everywhere. And so you had a lot of these incidents of basically pressure and, in his own words, threats coming from the EU to the point after they held these parliamentary elections, right, in the fall, where the Georgian Dream won. Once again, it's been a popular party for quite some time, that they decided to pause their ascension. And they said, we're going to pause it until 2028. We want to rethink everything that's been happening. And all of a sudden, the protests that were already taking place regarding the election results, although no one's been able to say that the elections were not free and fair, no one really provided that evidence, of course, they really exploded. But it seems like because the Georgian security services, police, government, they kind of had this little training, right, in the spring, I think they were ready, right? They were ready to deal with the protesters. And so they've been really firm, but they haven't been going too far in terms of managing the protests. Is that the Georgian security services, the police, have been very precise and firm without going too far with dealing with these protesters. So usually when we have this color revolutionary attempt, there needs to be some kind of a sacrificial victim. We've seen that in Ukraine with the snipers on roofs that were initially attributed to government. But of course, since then, we've had multiple reports, including reports coming out of Ukraine itself, where the snipers had nothing to do with the government. And some of them were actually Georgian snipers, according to one of the reports. So I think that's a little interesting connection between the two. One of many, right? Saakashvili was also a governor in Odessa for a while. So there are lots of interesting connections there. Georgian Legion fighting in Ukraine, etc. But anyway, it seems like the government has learned from the initial protests in May about not going too far. And now it seems like the protests are really fizzling out. So this seems to be a very interesting case study about managing this potentially explosive color revolutionary scenario and actually having it come down. Now, I think there might be a few reasons for this. One of them, I think there might not be as much popular support for these protests as there may be in other places because people did vote this party in. The other is that I think people understand that Georgia is not really being backed by Russia, and the West has been pretty hostile in this situation. So it's kind of on its own, and it's still been able to manage this course. And I think the ruling party is coming out on the winning side of things. So I think this was very interesting to compare to other instances. I know this was a long bit that I just gave you, Alex, but what do you think about it?
I agree with the way you put it, and I think that if the protests are just down to a segment of the population, airing their grievances, it does tend to die down eventually because people get tired. You can't be marching there for weeks on end. But what we know from examples in other countries is that usually it's the NGOs in the country that they kind of herd the people onto the streets. They call them and they say like, oh, this outrage, they stole the election. We have to go out and protest. They even pay them money for protesting. But then usually the protests themselves, which are generally people with sincere, let's call it sentiments, whether they're wrong or right, I'm not getting into that. But, they have a position and they have a grievance and they're protesting something legitimate. But then what you get is you get large crowds out in the streets, and now you throw in the provocation agents, the violent people who come prepared, trained up. They're usually brought there in buses or vans, and they come with skateboards, Molotov cocktails, a lot of these things and then they start provoking a violent response. And then when the security forces crack down, then everybody says like, oh, look, they're beating up the mostly peaceful protesters and things like that. And so now, the government starts to lose legitimacy, not only in the eyes of the foreign powers and foreign media and public opinion, but even in front of their own citizens, because, you usually control the media in these countries, and then the media interpret what's been going on, and they say like, look, it's the government. And we saw that in Ukraine because they had these Euromaidan protests, but the ordinary people didn't start attacking the police and start vandalizing and throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails. We had Yevgen Karas, who still is the leader of the C-14 neo-Nazi militia, who was saying that, well, of course we went in there to raise havoc, because if we didn't, the protests would have devolved to a gay parade. That was his words. And so, these elements, these violent neo-Nazi kind of
Provocateurs. Provocateurs, yeah. Agent provocateurs.
Agent provocateurs are brought there deliberately in a planned coup attempt. And in Ukraine, this was organized, this was all coordinated by the US Embassy. And
isn't it interesting that the Georgian Legion is not there to engage in these provocations because it's fighting in Ukraine, supposedly?
Yeah. And there's a joke. Do you know why there's never a color revolution in the United States?
There's no U.S. embassy.
Exactly.
Although, since, well, I'm not going to comment about the U.S. elections, but I mean, we can sort of talk about the more recent developments since 2020, maybe, where that may have changed that particular joke.
Yes, but we could really, in this discussion, we could add the United States into this whole death of democracy theme, because 2020 elections were clearly stolen. I mean, come on, really. But 2024 elections, I think that the American people said no mas, and they pushed back, and they busted these people who were trying to put in fake pre-selected ballots, and they overturned the result.
Do you think Americans are just more politically engaged because of their particular political culture as compared to, let's say, Western Europeans? It seems like Western Europeans are more apathetic, or does it have more to do with the way the system works?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to explain this to myself even. It seems to me that the Americans are, I don't know what percentage of the population, but some percentage of the population are prepared to actively defend their democracy. They are prepared to do what is expected of them. That is, they're prepared to do their civic duty. I don't know. I lived in the United States for 3 years. It's a strange thing because if you go to Croatia, all day, every day, the cafes are full and people are mostly talking politics and arguing, and so you would think that we have a much more politically awakened populace, but I would say for the most part they're just as much suckers as anybody else for all these things. And generally we expect that we're going to get the shaft from the powers that be. And when we do get the shaft, we kind of go like, yeah, it figures. And life goes on and we go back to the cafes and argue about this and that. I think that the Americans are more boots on the ground. Let's take action and let's make sure that this doesn't get away from us.
Well, it also seems to be happening, like you said, where in Moldova, where the election was manipulated, it seems, in Romania, where the result was overturned, where people seem to be waking up a little bit, but they're sort of on the outskirts of Europe, right? There's always been this question, what is Europe? We're not going to include those people to the east that have been in the Eastern Bloc as real Europeans. So it's very interesting.
They're just a little bit inferior.
Right. So it's interesting to see, much like North Koreans being savages who don't fall for provocations. Yeah, they seem to be smarter than people that are supposed to be the cream of the crop of civilization.
Yeah. Just before we move away from Georgia protests topic, they are a lot alike the Euromaidan stuff, but at the same time, they look a lot like the protests that we had in Brazil at the time in 2014 as well, 2014-15, that culminated with Dilma Rousseff impeachment procedures. I even post some related pictures. We've seen the machine gun firework guy on Georgia. We had the same in Brazil back at the time. Just lower technology. They improved for this one is more colorful and beautiful, but we had pretty much the same thing. And what happened? The special point that I think it's important for people to understand is that, the snipers were pretty blatant, pretty tough. But in Brazil, for example, there was a firework. Someone shot a firework just next to a cameraman that was filming the protests, and the guy died. because it exploded just next to his head. So that was
Oh,
one of the trigger that also pushed the population. So we are, and before the snipers in the Euromaidan, there were some, activists, quote unquote, that were shot dead by the police. That started to trigger escalation on the protests. Georgia's situation, yeah, I think it's dying down, but at the same time, I'm expecting something on that scale. Perhaps not the snipers, but something like the Brazilian case. A reporter or someone, and I think that's another important point for people that, especially in Brazil, that's going to watch this show. Many of these agent provocateurs that you mentioned, there's a name for the ones in Georgia. In Brazil, we used to call them the black blocs. There's always some trendy name and hashtagable stuff. The ones in Georgia, I think, is the same as the ones in Ukraine. Somehow there's a relation on the language there that they call it the same name. They not always they are portrayed as pro-government, like soldiers, people that are pro-government and go there, but they are actually paid by the same persons that pay the NGOs to create the protests, to fight against the protests. And that's interesting to understand, because people think, oh, that's the government, paying people or doing. No, they fight themselves, and that's on purpose, to create this kind of scenario where you have, a dead cameraman.
Well, it's kind of like
Unfortunately,
you fund multiple political parties, regardless of which one wins. It's your guy, right? It doesn't matter what their actual
Yeah.
politics are like. You're funding everyone. I think that that exists elsewhere. So just to kind of wrap up the question of Europe, do you think there's any hope for Western Europe to have a little bit more of the awakening, or is it just impossible because of the structure of the EU, it being managed from the outside? Or is it going to be kind of like what you described, people debating fiercely in cafes, but not really, not getting the political result they might want?
yeah, that's what I'm concerned about, because I think that the political awakening is not absent. I just don't know whether the Europeans have actual venues of redress, whether they can change anything, because, we've seen the German people try to change things. The political preferences are shifting. We've seen the French people vote first for the right wing government. That was in July, I think, the elections. They were going to vote right wing, and then Macron and the left wingers kind of engineered to unite the left wing parties so that they're a heavier bloc. So then in the second round, they scored an overwhelming victory, but then he didn't let them form governments anyway, and then he put in some compromise government that barely had any support from anybody, and that all fell apart. And now he just nominated another prime minister that is his political ally, and nothing that people. And I don't see what the French people can do. And if you don't have a venue for redress, then there's risk that these social revolts escalate to the point that you end up having a storming of Bastille type thing, and then they start wheeling out the guillotines and chopping up people they don't, and then it devolves to a complete terror. But this is again deliberate fomenting of chaos, which is also part of the process of militarizing and Nazifying a society. This is what's been going on in Ukraine prior to this war, and this is what's been going on in Germany during the 1930s. Complete and total chaos, political assassinations by the thousands, non-stop strikes, non-stop crises, and then you bring the Nazi party to power, and then you unleash credit and help and aid and all of these things, and then Hitler looks like a winner. And so I'm afraid that everything that's being done in Europe now is that they're preparing us, to keep on fighting the Russians to the last Romanian, then to the last Pole, and Bulgarian, and German, and Austrian, and Hungarian, and Slovak, and so on and so on. They just won't give up on this. It's 75 freaking trillion dollars of collateral there. That's got to be ours. That's our collateral. The Russians have to just let us have it, and that's that.
It's just a territory that houses resources. It's not.
Yeah, and because they won't let us have it, look what they're making us do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, speaking of chaos, fomenting chaos and terror, let's talk briefly to wrap this episode up about Syria. Because on the one hand, that's a very different situation. But in terms of the mask slipping, I think the rebranding of an Al-Qaeda offshoot, HTS, into pro-diversity moderate rebels, including the way the leader, Al-Jolani, of this organization that's being dressed. First if you kind of, there's all these memes, including the meme that I shared recently, where he looks like your typical terrorist a decade ago. And then more recently, he's presented in the exact same clothes as Zelensky. He's got a similar haircut. And even more recently, he's now wearing a suit. So he's definitely so the Western media, the official Western media, is an overdrive in terms of trying to promote these people that carried out regime change as moderates. We've already discussed Syria on a couple of episodes, and I think it's still a very murky situation because we don't really, we know some of the facts and we know some of the facts on the ground, but we don't quite understand. Well, there are theories, of course, about what Russia did and didn't do, what Turkey did and didn't do. It's very obvious what Israel is doing, and I think it's pretty obvious what the US is doing. But some of these are, I think, we need more time to see how these powers act to really understand what happened. But in terms of just that mask slipping and the rebranding of people who, as late as 2018, were on the US terror list, and, a $10 million dollar reward was on Al-Jolani's head. That tweet is still up. We talked about this recently. And all of a sudden, there are talks coming, even from the UN, saying, we have to stop using the term terrorist. They're going to have to come to the table. You have the former Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch, who is no longer the director, but he still promotes similarly problematic issues, saying, these guys are going to be involved in the international court to persecute Assad. So you basically have this really brazen rebranding of people that were universally, at least in the official West, in Russia, etc., considered to be terrorists, are now being presented as these saviors, these pro-diversity, pro-ethnic diversity, maybe even pro-women, just things that are completely outside of the realm of possibility. And just the media is in overdrive in presenting them in this way. And at the same time, we're getting information from the ground. We don't know if all the videos that are circulating are true. There's some rumors that some of them are older, but nonetheless, there are some awful things that are happening on the ground. So I wanted to know your take. Again, it's sort of, we talked about Israel and Palestine very briefly in terms of the mask slipping. How do you see Syria in this regard?
To me, the whole thing in Syria doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As you said, we know some facts. We know a lot of facts. We just don't know exactly which facts are true and which facts aren't true. A few years ago, Grayzone had an article based on a large data dump from the UK government. It was written by Ben Norton, which showed that the whole agenda, the whole war, was being choreographed for the public consumption in the West and in the Arab world by a bunch of Western-sponsored public relations agencies who really had a tight control over just about everything, where these jihadi leaders would give interviews, what they would say, how they would say it. They had one of the agencies had, and probably still has, a network of 1,600 so-called activist reporters on the ground who are feeding them facts, and then they contrive the desired story and package it up for whatever for whatever effect they want. And I remember at the time I thought, they brought out this al-Baghdadi, right, the head of ISIS, and then they would show him in still photographs speaking at a mosque, and always looking like a terrorist. There always has to be a finger pointing up and then giving a speech. I thought, why don't they ever show us the audience? Where are the people? Who's he speaking to? And there never was a picture of the audience. It was just him, lecturing somebody. And so I suspected that, these were, very, very, contrived stories that for whatever effect. And then, there was this data dump from the UK government that, sure enough. And so we have the same, I think that we have pretty much the same today. And so all at once, out of nowhere, we started having all these stories about how terrible Syrian army it was, and how poorly the soldiers are paid, and how corrupt the commanders are. And Bashar al-Assad all of a sudden was turned into this cartoon villain. I don't really know all that much about Bashar al-Assad, but if you listen to his speeches and his interviews, he sounds like a very reasonable and principled man. And
if you go to the articles from 2005 or so from the New York Times, they just absolutely gush about they talk about his wife as the Princess Diana of Levant, right? Just absolutely glowing reviews. So having that change to what you're describing, I think to me is very telling, even without knowing that, perhaps he's not this, beautiful democratic leader.
But it got out of the gate almost out of nowhere. Just like all of a sudden there was a flood of these stories about, his large collection of really expensive cars. I don't know. I knew that he had a Porsche. That's about it. I don't know about the rest, but I didn't see any big garage and big collection of Ferraris and Bugattis and all of this stuff. I suspect that it's vastly exaggerated stuff. And now, he left, he fled the country and didn't even bother to rescue his family members. And some of them got even killed. And maybe he even cackled with glee about, leaving them behind to die. And, all of these stories that they don't make much sense. And then, the account of soldiers being paid poorly and the commanders being corrupt. I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense at all. I was there. I was a soldier at war, and I guarantee you I was paid extremely poorly. It wasn't a factor. We weren't there because the pay was great and we got a good dental plan or anything like that. You were there because that was your duty. You were in a total institution under orders with commanders, and if they told you you do this, you obey your orders and you do what you do what you're told. For soldiers to just kind of reckon, nah, I'm not paid enough for this. I'm out of here, and then they change into their civilian clothes and they just go home. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way at all. This is like, I think only people who have never been in the army can even believe stuff like that. But all these narratives started gushing out of Syria along with these things. So, for me, I have to look at patterns of events to try to kind of discern what seems credible or what doesn't seem credible. So one thing is that we know that Syria had about 270,000 troops under arms. They had 8 years since lifting the siege of Aleppo in December of 2016 until this December. They had full 8 years to regroup and rearm and build up their defensive positions. They knew where the danger was coming from, Idlib, among other places, and they knew that Aleppo was the first target, and then Damascus farther south. So, and then these jihadis, it was like a collection of different groups, many of whom are mutually hostile with each other, most of whom are mercenaries, right? Busting into Syria on pickup trucks with light weapons, no air cover, no tanks, no armored personnel carriers, and they just cut like hot knife through butter through a real military organization with real weapons, with airplanes and helicopters and tanks and heavy weaponry. Sorry, that's just not even possible. Not in 10 days' time. It doesn't. It just, to me, I thought this is like when they were telling us that office fires brought down World Trade Center 7. It just cannot be. And so anyway, I thought the only way for the whole institute, military is a proper institution of society. It's robust. It has levels of hierarchy. It has people working there. There's a strong patriotism element, meaning it's not transactional that you say like, hey, where's my bonus? I'm not fighting now. When you join the military, you already sign up for a complete crap deal because you signed away your life potentially in exchange for nothing, basically. So the fact that this whole institution would just vaporize in 10 days' time before a gang of 30,000 jihadis on pickup trucks is inconceivable. So the only way that a whole military can vanish in that 10 days' time, if there were orders given from the very top of the command and control hierarchy. Go ahead, Marcelo.
I was watching yesterday Alexander Mercury's, which, by the way, I would like to recommend people that is going to be watching this, watch the interview that Alex gave to Countercurrents to Larry Johnson. It was amazing. It was excellent. And many of the points that you just made here, you also talked there and some other things. But just yesterday, I was watching Alexander Mercury's from the Duran, and he actually got his hand in some documents, or someone sent him some documents that those 30,000 that you mentioned, and we've been working with this number, which is a high number, but as you mentioned, poorly weaponed, poorly geared. Even the how's it called? The trucks were not even the NATO badass.
Exactly. There were pickup trucks that you could, no protection whatsoever. You wouldn't even go into combat like that.
But the thing is that apparently it was not even there were 30,000 in total, but the group that went straight forward was like 350 people.
Yeah,
it was just
a
couple of dudes.
Yes. The group that took Aleppo was 300 people apparently, or maybe 350. Doesn't matter. But so things like this just don't happen. Something was decided somewhere at some level, and so I assumed that it would have been decided between the Russians and the Iranians.
In the first few days, you were getting reports from the Russian media that there was striking this many terrorists and this many casualties happened to the terrorists, and all of a sudden those reports disappeared too. So there must have been some kind of interaction, like you're saying, at the highest level of maybe not even the Syrian government, but multiple people involved in other places.
Yes, and also there's a mystery of what happened to the Syrian Arab Army, because that's 270,000 troops, tanks, howitzers, cannons, all kinds of gear. What happened to it? They didn't vaporize, right? Something. And so anyway, like also from Larry Johnson, I got the information that one whole tank division led by Bashar al-Assad's brother crossed the border to Iraq. And then today, Pepe Escobar, in some interview, I think with Danny Haifong, said that Russia's Spetsnaz extricated Russia's top, Syria's top military general. I think his name was Hassan al-Husseini, something like this. And they took him to Moscow, along with, maybe not on the same flight, but they took Bashar al-Assad and his family, and they also took out this general. And the rest of the Syria's military, well, what if they decided to adopt the same approach to warfare like the Houthis and Hamas and the Hezbollah, going underground and going for a guerrilla attrition warfare? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But this was a decision. So all these narratives that are spewing out of Syria now, they don't make sense to me. This was and also, we have to also guess what was the objective, what's the agenda. I can't make out what Erdogan is doing, whether he's in on this or whether he got duped into it. The initial stories that he backstabbed the Russians and he backstabbed the Iranians, that's not panning out really, because you can see that they are carrying on in a very, very friendly way altogether. So, if Erdogan is a certified double-dealing backstabbers, who's to say that he didn't backstab the UK and the US and the Israelis? It takes time to know. It takes time for the dust to settle and to things to play out. In 2003, it may have looked like the US troops, in their overwhelming superiority, just overthrew the Taliban and walked triumphantly into Kabul. What does it look like 20 years later? It's not looking so good. And after $4 trillion and 20 years, they had to hand Afghanistan back to that same Taliban. Same with Iraq, same with Libya, same with Ukraine. So, the long-term trajectory of all these misadventures of the Western Empire, of the Anglo-American Empire, is a very solid downtrend. And all these momentary successes that everybody's celebrating and chest thumping and trash talking, this is just like a series of Pyrrhic victories. And I think that in the same way they were celebrating Afghanistan, they have the same reason to celebrate Syria right now. And I think that Israelis just walked into a death trap.
Well, I think chaos is always unpredictable. And so there's just no way to foresee all the consequences like you're describing in the initial stages, especially of a very murky situation to begin with. Well, it's obviously more murky to us news consumers as opposed to maybe the governments. So can you elaborate on Israel as maybe one of our last topics? Why do you think Israel overstretched itself by going into past the Golan Heights?
Well, Israel overstretched itself already before that. They took on Hamas in Gaza. The IDF is very fully aware that they are geared for quick, rapid victories, overwhelming force, clean up. It's got to be done in a couple of weeks. Well, now they're bogged down there for well over a year, and they still didn't defeat Hamas. They still didn't return the hostages. It's a festering cesspool that just kind of swept under the carpet. Then they went and took on Hezbollah against very stern protests of the IDF. So the political establishment is pushing the IDF. For political reasons, we have to go to Lebanon. And they get their teeth broken there. A massive failure. Okay, yeah, so they assassinated Nasrallah and the top leadership, but if today you assassinated the Pope, that wouldn't be the end of the Catholic Church. Hezbollah is also a proper organization. It's an institution of the Lebanese society. It doesn't go away just because you killed the Hezbollah's Pope and his leadership team. There's other people, equally committed. Okay, so they didn't defeat Hezbollah either. And they're still getting ballistic missiles lobbed into Israel from Yemen. And they can go to Yemen and blow things up. But, even the Americans and the French and the British sending their aircraft carriers and destroyers and everything they have, for how long? It's been 15, 16 months now, the Operation Prosperity Guardian. They can't do anything. So the Houthis are still there, and they're still lobbing missiles. And the maritime traffic through the Red Sea is still bogged down. Anyway, so didn't defeat the Houthis, didn't defeat Hamas, didn't defeat Hezbollah. They're all still there. Their military is already overstretched. Their economy is destroyed. Their soldiers are exhausted. Suicides are high. Psychological
immigration is high. I mean, people have been leaving.
Immigration is high. Desertion is high. So it's falling apart at the seams. So, with Syria, I think that Benjamin Netanyahu and the crazies around him saw an opportunity to present this big success. And then they always project this success onto the next big thing. And Netanyahu is always trying to project this image of great power and invincibility and this very, very extremely clever cunning that, you're going to get a death blow, but you don't even know where it's going to come or when, but we always win. Okay, but we know that behind the facade, behind all the, chest thumping, things are looking absolutely dismal. And Israel has pretty much been strategically defeated. Israel without the United States doesn't stand a chance of surviving. It's game over. And the United States can no longer help Israel because since World War II up until now, the United States hegemony has rested primarily on force projection, which pretty much means carrier strike groups. So if anybody's not behaving, everybody's being uppity, they just send the carrier strike groups there with all these planes and missiles and if you don't prostrate yourself and submit, then they bomb the crap out of you. Or, they send in special forces and they assassinate somebody, but, you can kill people, you can't establish a new political order. Anyway, so now that the Houthis have demonstrated that they have supersonic missiles that they cannot take down, they don't even see them on the radar, and they can strike targets with pinpoint accuracy. What does that tell you? The missile that the Houthis launched at Israel, I think it was in October of this year, or August, I forget, doesn't matter. But it traveled 2,140 kilometers, and it struck its target after 11 minutes flight, i.e. And it overflew like American Navy ships, and they didn't even see it on their radar. So what is it? And it struck the targets in Tel Aviv exactly as aim. So what does that tell you? That tells you that if they want to sink an American aircraft carrier, they can do that anytime.
I think this is why Putin mentioned that in his typically trolling way, the duel between the Oreshnik missile and the NATO or air defense, right? Choose your city. I mean, it's a very dark gallows humor, but I think he is motivated by some of these incidents as well, in addition to this newer technology.
Yeah, but they are now kind of reinterpreting what Vladimir Putin was saying as though it was some kind of a cold, callous, dark, I don't know, deviant humor or something like this. But he was saying something completely appropriate, because they were saying like, oh, look, we have all these ATACMS and blah, blah, and we're striking you inside Russia, and haha, aren't you now in a weak position? And he said, well, okay. Oh, yeah. I forget exactly the way they got him to that statement, but basically it was like, you don't have this technology, or it's experimental, or we can shoot it down, or something like that. And he said, like, okay, if you want a high-tech duel, give us a target, bring your best anti-aircraft and air defense system, and we'll send a missile and see if you can intercept it. What's wrong with that? Of course, the West will never accept this duel because they know that they would lose. And then all of those weapons imagine the order books that collapse. And, for them, selling these weapon systems is far more important than winning any war. It's like, like the British giving Ukrainians their super duper Challenger 2 tanks, but okay, you can parade it around, just don't go anywhere near the Russians with this thing, because we told all our...
It's gonna get stuck in the mud immediately.
Well, yeah, it's also, they're selling it as this invincible thing with impenetrable secret armor made out of kryptonite or whatever they have. So they can't, if it gets blown up by the Russians, then wherever they're selling it, people are going to say, well, you said it was indestructible, but it got blown up by the Russians. So then they're not going to buy it from you anywhere, and your profits are gone.
Yeah, I think that alone is a very dark thought. I mean, there's been many statements made about using Ukraine as a weapons testing ground, in addition to achieving these particular geopolitical
said
goals.
It himself. Zelensky himself said it.
Which is even darker, right? Speaking of gallows humor.
Zelensky basically was going around just like a salesman, a bad car salesman, say, "Oh, thank you for this system," and then he gets like a list and say, "Oh, thank you for the Abrams and this and that and that and that." Come on, dude, you can do better than that. You're an actor. I could do better than that, and I'm not an actor.
Well, I think his acting is very specific, i.e. playing the piano with various body parts, right? So not quite Shakespearean actor right there too. Yeah, so I don't know if he can portray an adequate and believable weapons salesperson. But yeah, I think, Alex, we've got a 2-part episode here. This has been very, very helpful. I wasn't intending to discuss the Middle East in this much detail, and I think you gave our viewers some really interesting insights in the way that I certainly wasn't thinking about this. Although your comment about Israel acting opportunistically, this is something that I've been thinking myself, because usually they talk about the long-term plan for greater Israel, and it doesn't mean that doesn't exist in the minds of certain politicians, but it doesn't seem like they're systematically carrying out the plan. It seems to be they jump on the opportunity without really maybe evaluating all the, and it might be impossible to evaluate some of the consequences that come from basically fomenting chaos to this extent. So
yeah, I think they swallowed the lure, and that's when the shit part starts.
Well, I don't know how much more of a war in the Middle East we really need, because we have so many flashpoints right now. It seems really terrifying if you actually think about it. But I think we can wrap up this almost like a 2-part episode here. I know it's very late on your end, so this is going to be like our Christmas special, our new calendar Christmas special. Do you have any suggestions about maybe something you've posted recently on your social media, which of course we'll link to this episode, that people might want to check out, something you've done recently?
Well, remotely related to this is a problem that we in the West, for a variety of reasons, but also largely thanks to the Project Ukraine, we're going to end up in an inflationary environment, which is, it sounds like it isn't very much, but inflation is far and away the most destructive and the most indiscriminate force of wealth destruction. And so this is something that people in the West, United States, Europe, UK, Canada, and elsewhere have to take into account. And, you have to kind of think about how to protect yourself from this, because, I think it was Alexander Hamilton or somebody like this who said that the power over a man's livelihood is a power over his will. And I think that this inflation is kind of putting us on a slippery slope towards that destination of owning nothing and being happy. And so anyway, I started a new Substack, which will be predominantly market oriented. And today and yesterday, I published 2 articles about inflation. The one today is how to protect yourself against inflation. And so that's on the new Substack called iSystem Trend Following.
So we will link all the links. Is it linked to your X/Twitter as well?
This Substack, maybe not. I don't know.
Oh my goodness, you're not very good at promoting yourself.
You're talking to the world's worst salesman and marketer.
After Zelensky.
After Zelensky.
No, he's the best.
He's the best, yeah, in some ways. Yeah, so everyone, if you guys are interested in obviously protecting yourself in very uncertain economic circumstances, go to Alex's Substack. You can see he is an expert in a lot of topics, but he's definitely an expert on markets and economics. I think this is where we're going to wrap up the episode. Marcelo, do you have any parting words?
Well, again, thank you very much, Alex, for coming back. 3rd time on the Winter Latina Show. And I would like to thank everybody for watching this show tonight as well. All the links will be, as always, on the description. And so since today, which is in the future, is Christmas, what's it called? The new calendars.
New calendar.
Christmas.
Well, when I say Gregorian calendar, people get very confused. When you say Orthodox or some Orthodox celebrate it, it's easier to say new calendar than than Gregorian. Well, Gregorian Julian is a little bit murky for some people. Saying Protestant Catholic versus Orthodox, some people say, but we're Orthodox, but we follow the new calendar, like some of the Greeks. So yeah, I basically just say new calendar versus old calendar. So Merry new calendar Brazil, Christmas.
Brazilian Christmas. Merry Christmas to you all, and Merry Christmas to everybody around the world that celebrates today. Next week, 2 weeks from now, I'll say Merry Christmas.
We'll do another one. We'll have a 2 weeks of Christmas.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Merry Christmas, and thank you for having me.
Merry Christmas,
thank
Alex.
You all.
Nina,
see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.